Good morning. You can see me now sitting under a banyan tree. It's a very old tree, and what is really striking here are, as you can see, those roots that are hanging. You can hear the birds, but then I am talking about roots. I'm talking about, when we talk about roots, we are talking about our ancestry. We are talking about times past, we are talking about history and the way in which we search for our roots. How do we search for the roots of a nation? We talk about the history of a nation, but then I would like to ask at this point, how do we talk about the roots that formed the idea of a nation? What is this nation that I am talking about? I am talking about Canada. What are the roots that made possible the idea of the nation Canada as we see it today? When we talk about Canada, we go back in time thousands of years ago, back in time, so long ago. We need to go back in time, like the way in which the roots go deep down and also draw sustenance from its surroundings. That, in a way, is the story of Canada. One of the early narratives that come to mind when we talk about Canada has to do with the movement, the passage of people, the movement of people across continents, across what is known in history as the Bering Strait or the Bering Bridge. You have had people migrating from one part of landmass across the bridge to what is present day Canada. It's one of those early histories of migration, and attempts to settle down in that very cold climate with so much of fresh water and so much of land mass. Now imagine this, people traveling. So there is this remarkable history of migration, of trying to, if not settle down, of trying to live with the surroundings, of trying to live with the bison and the salmon and the moose and the muskrat and the beaver and all other flora and fauna that we get to see in Canada. There is another very interesting story that we have of when we talk about Canada that has to do with the wild geese. There's a remarkable way in which they fly. There's a V formation. That's how they fly. And what that indicates for me is that spirit of freedom in a way, and the way in which it's able to move forward, move together. And that perhaps is a remarkable idea of migration. We can talk about the migration of a whole lot of species, but then let's say of the whales, for example, of fish, and the way in which they move from waters having different kinds of temperatures. But then after that, you have had people settling down there who kind of let's say disseminated, who split up, diversified into different tribes, evolving different languages, and then learning to live with a very different kind of an ecosystem. Now think of those many number of tribes and languages and practices and rituals and the wilderness that is Canada. This is history which is quite old. Now the point of European presence, the times when Europe entered Canada, that is very interesting. How did Europe come to Canada? It started with those explorations with the Renaissance, where they tried to explore different continents and different routes for trade. And so you have this French captain Jacques Cartier coming to Canada through taking the Laurentian River, coming to Canada, and then erecting a cross at a place called Gaspe. That's the French name, that's the name that is given by the French, because the indigenous population did not say that this place was called or is called Gaspe. Think of the, I want to, before we talk about this landing and the trade relations that were there, I want to talk about the landmass very briefly. On the north you have the Arctic Ocean, and then on one side you have the Atlantic, and on the other you have the Pacific. So here is a continent which is covered on three sides, one part of North America covered on three sides by water: Arctic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean. So from coast to coast, this is what describes Canada, from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now one might ask, what about the United States? There also you have the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other, and that is the reason why when we study American literature, American history, we talk about the expansion from the Atlantic seaboard interior. You keep going inside, and that is where you talk about expansion, American expansionism. But then with Canada, it is not a case of expansionism in that sense. It was more of an exploration, a very different kind of an exploration, especially with the French coming in, exploring, and then doing trade, doing business with the indigenous people who were living there. What was the business that they did? They traded in fur, in fish, in meat, in the skin of the buffalo. They came here for trade. They took these goods, Europeans took these goods, the French, they took these goods, and then instead of that, what did they bring in? They brought in quite a few very interesting things. They brought, first thing, gunpowder, because they wanted raw material. So you gave them guns. There was a certain rhythm in which the local population was living. They would hunt. They knew how to hunt, and they knew how to preserve meat and survive into the next winter, or through to the next summer, through the winter. But then there is this classic theory of supply and demand. So Europeans came, they wanted more material, so you had to supply more raw materials. So the hunt increased. You used gunpowder, you used this technology, and so what happened was there was this balance of species, there was a kind of an ecological balance. This was affected. So that changed, and so the life rhythm of the local population, that changed, that was transformed. So guns were introduced for economic purposes, tobacco, and then the most important introduction, I would say, was liquor. It was barter system, so they brought in whiskey. People drank that, but then it became addiction, it became addictive. So it brought in a whole lot of other issues. The French were defeated in 1812 by the British. The French became a minority there, and the English came in, they colonized the place. And along with that, as this happened before the French were defeated, around that time, what happened was they brought in blankets because it was very cold. So they brought in blankets, they gave blankets, but unfortunately the blankets had, the blankets that they brought in were all infected blankets, which wiped out a lot of indigenous people. There was a pandemic, word that we use today. It wiped out populations, it wiped out a whole lot of tribes. So that is a very, very painful history that we have when we look at Canada, how tribes were annihilated, completely erased from the face of the earth. and with that their practices, their rituals, all that got erased. Now, that was not the only reason why cultures were erased. There were other interesting reasons as well, important reasons as well, as to how and why this happened. I was talking about how the French were defeated and the British came there, they tried to settle down. They advertised, so this is later on, it took some time. They advertised the land in Canada and they said that whoever wants to go and settle down in Canada, they can do that, because there was a lot of land available for cultivation, for agriculture. Remember, England is a teeny weeny island, and Canada was this undulating landscape that was available. So the British encouraged settlement. So there were these pioneers and they were talking about settlement. The word colonization was not used. The word used was settlement. So you try to settle Canada. You settle. How do you settle? You advertised and then you gave land. How do you settle a new land? It's a different question when you ask how do you colonize a new land? How do you settle a new land? You had advertisements, like I said earlier, and then people came, but then how do you tame the land? How do you grow? How do you grow? How do you cultivate in this land? Because it was all bush, it was all thick vegetation that you had. You had to clear the vegetation. So how do you clear the vegetation? It required labor, it required interaction with the local population, but then the local population had different ideas. Their way of life was very different. They were essentially nomadic, and here you had a whole lot of people who came in, who were trying to settle down. So where will you settle down? If you look at the history of Western Canada, it's very interesting, because you had these tribes who were traveling from place to place. They would travel, they would know where they would get their meal, their food, and they'll hunt. They were hunters. But then it's not that they built houses and cultivated, grew products and then lived there. They never lived like that. So when you settle down, you have these settlements, you needed to have transport, you needed to have roads, and then came in one major challenge. The British tried to introduce the railways. That's called something called the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, which connected the Pacific coast, the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, and they had to drill through the Laurentian Shield, which was very difficult. This is talked about, this is mentioned in E.J. Pratt's poem Towards the Last Pike. So I was talking about migration, and I'm talking about the ways, different ways in which people have tried to migrate to different places, and then try to see if they can discover roots there. That is why I am sitting under this tree. Let me try to reinstate that point. So how do you become mobile and yet try to have roots, try to grow roots? To settle down is to grow roots. So how do you grow roots? One of the things that the settlers did was that, as I mentioned earlier, they tried to construct a railway line. It's a huge tract of land, a huge, massive landscape. Look at the number of time zones Canada has. That will tell you about its expansiveness and the kind of terrain. So you had to bring in iron, and then you had to you had to survey the land, and then you had to construct the railway. You needed labor. How did you get labor? You got the Chinese to come in. They got the Chinese came, they constructed the railway line. They had a very, very important role to play in the construction of the railway line. But then, if you look at the poem, E.J. Pratt's poem, or if you look at some of those early narratives about the construction of the railway line, or even if you look at the archived photographs of the erection of the railway line, you will not have much references to the Chinese. That they looked at the Chinese only as laborers. They were not allowed to bring in their families. They were here only as labor. They constructed this. A whole lot of people died. Many of them lost their limbs, their hands, their ability to move. and if they had to bring in their family, there was a head tax, and that was quite exorbitant, and the Chinese couldn't afford it. It was very difficult to bring in families, and that also did shape a remarkable cultural phenomenon in North America. It is for that reason that today we talk about the China towns. So there's a very interesting way in which China found roots in Canada. So there is this remarkable, very fascinating relationship when we explore, when we understand the history of Canada. This Canada was under the British, even to there are remnants of, let's say, British presence even to this day, if I am not mistaken, in Canada. You have the British, the Canadian currency still has the Queen's head stamped on it, Queen Elizabeth's head, and the constitutional head continues to be the Queen of England. But then it's a settler nation. Canada is a settler nation. So I talked about how the Chinese came there, the Japanese came there, there are Indians who have come there, there are people from Eastern Europe who have come, from Russia. The Mennonites have come to Canada. The Greeks have come, the Italians have come, people from Africa have come, people from the Caribbean have come, people have from Asian subcontinent, from the Asian region, people have traveled to the Caribbean, to Africa, and from there moved to Canada. So there is a remarkable journey that happens from all across the world, which in a way is very fascinating. And it has official Canada would say that they have always welcomed immigrants, but then to welcome somebody is not an easy thing. This is what we learn today in the world. It also would have gone through a lot of process. It takes time to learn how to receive people, and this is something that we get to understand if we examine the whole history of Canada's migration policy, the way in which Canada's immigration policy evolved over a period of time. There have been important landmarks in Canada, especially with regards to the way in which people have come into Canada and the way in which people have tried to relate to the land. Now, let me go back a little bit and then talk about this whole idea of this whole thing that happened regarding settling the land. Because how do you settle? The question is this: how do you settle in a new country? How do you settle down in Canada? What are the challenges? What are the tasks? And how do you do it? One very crucial thing that did happen was that it did affect the lives of the indigenous population. So I am going back in time a little bit. It affected the life of the indigenous populations. If we read newspapers recently, it's been happening in Canada, but then when we read newspapers, we see how there were all these schools, these reservations, residential schools where children were forcibly taken to from their families, and they were forced to stay there. They lost their language, they lost their culture. Most important, they lost their lives. So today we would refer to this as cultural genocide. Hundreds and thousands of children died in these residential schools. They were harassed physically, psychologically, in other words, mentally, sexually, and otherwise. And it was very traumatizing. A whole lot of them perished, and there are mass burial sites. So it becomes, in a way, a question of human rights, the right to live, the right to live one's own culture, the right to be oneself. So this is true probably of every culture. I am not saying that this is something that happened only in Canada or is unique to Canada. This is something that would have happened everywhere. When we talk about culture, it can happen, we can talk about culture only when we recognize the kind of blood and the violence that would have been shed for quite some time. We cannot overlook this. Lakdasa Vikramasinghe, for example, has this beautiful poem which opens like this: "Don't talk to me about Mattis," which talks about what culture is, which is a remarkable poem that talks about how cultures evolve and civilization. And it's a question of settling down. Now, Lakdasa Vikramasinghe is not a Canadian poet, he's a Sri Lankan poet. I've been asking again and again, how do you settle in a new country, and what is the settlement all about? I talked about how a whole lot of children, young children, perished as the Europeans tried to settle down, because they were settling down, they were bringing in a kind of a cultural baggage. They were trying to settle down an English country in Canada. There was the French already there, and there are all these other communities who are trying to come in and settle down. And the policies, the migration policies that Canada had, that also had a major say in the way in which the modern Canada as a nation has evolved. Now, as we run through some of these important landmarks, there is one other thing to recognize, to notice, and that is the Multicultural Act of 1971 and the way in which that has been incorporated into Canadian socio-political cultural life, and what it has or how it has defined or tried to define Canada. Because this is seen as a very, very important, a very significant milestone or step when we try to understand Canada today. But the reason why I am talking about the Multicultural Act is to see how this nation has tried to bring in a whole lot of cultures together, and it talks about an ideal, almost even a utopian idea of sharing and living together, different communities coexisting, sharing beliefs, etc., which also tries to guarantee identities which are not asked to assimilate into a cauldron, as it were. Now, this is the principle. It's a beautiful principle. In theory, it is fantastic. But then, it is like, I have always felt that Canadian multiculturalism is like a bowl of a lot of fruits with ice cream in it. It's not the usual fruit salad that we talk about. But then what's very important when we talk about Canadian multiculturalism is to imagine ice cream with a lot of fruits there. Fruits cut in different sizes and shapes, and then you have the ice cream. What is very fascinating is the relationship that two pieces of fruits would have with each other. They can be so very dissimilar, and the space, the quantum of ice cream that would be there, that would bind together these 2 or 3 different pieces as a test case. There could be more number of pieces. So, imagine this variety. This is the way in which I understand multiculturalism. It may not be Canadian multiculturalism, but then a lot of things can happen because the ice cream can melt, and if you keep it for long, the fruits can start rotting. So, how do you keep it fresh? So, the most important question is to ensure that the salad bowl remains fresh. Now, it is not enough to say that we have a multiculturalism policy or a multicultural act, but how do you keep it fresh? Now, it is this question perhaps that the indigenous communities have asked. It is perhaps the same question that all other peoples, all other nations who have tried to discover a space in Canada have tried to address living in Canada, and this perhaps accounts for Canada's vibrancy. Now, I am not saying that there is no racial discrimination. It is there, like you have it everywhere. There are questions of race, there are questions of human rights violations. All these things are present everywhere across the world. It's no different. But then it's a matter of keeping the fruit salad fresh, and one way in which you can do that is to think always about the way in which you would try to relate to the community that is next to you. How do you belong to not just your community? How do you tell, or how do you acknowledge the presence and the culture of another community next to you, it could be next door. How do you do it? When we ask this question, when we address this issue, there is this whole question of the cultural genocide I was talking about earlier with relation to the indigenous population of Canada. So it's a very, very tricky, very volatile kind of a terrain, and it is not a one size fits all kind of a legislation that Canada has. It cannot have something like that. No country can ever have a one size fits all kind of a legislation. If we are talking about cultures, if we are talking about plurality, if we are talking about that ability to listen to other people, other culture, other voices. So this is possibly one way of trying to understand Canadian multiculturalism. And what it also does is that it is possible therefore to, that's all nations can do. Nations can only imagine things, right? I am not talking about imagined nations, I am talking about how nations can only imagine things. How can a nation imagine the world, contain the world in itself? And one very good experiment in that regard would be Canada, because it is trying to imagine the world in that one nation. Trying to imagine the world, all these communities, all these peoples trying to come living in Canada in whatever way they are living. And when you live in a place, when you try to make a place a home, it will have its own attendant concerns, problems, challenges. And I think what we look forward to today is to see how Canada addresses those challenges. It is fraught with a whole lot of issues, cultural issues, the kind of issues probably it does have with its powerful neighbor, the United States, the kind of relation let us say it has with the United Kingdom, with Britain, with all other countries from where people have migrated to Canada. The way in which it has tried to address the concerns of the indigenous population, the way in which, let us say, it has tried to address, to apologize to, let us say, Japan for the excesses that happened during the Second World War. There are questions of identity, there are questions of language, and there is this large question of Quebec in Canada. The referendums that have happened in Canada, and the relationships that are there between the French and the English Canadians, right? So it's a very, very happening, very colorful kind of a cultural, socio-cultural scenario that seems to inform what Canada is. And it is for this reason perhaps that Canada has articulated, continues to express its vibrancy in terms of its involvement in, let's say, in international affairs, especially in the field of culture. The kind of literature that Canada has produced, the vibrancy, the richness that it has had, that variety that it has been able to guarantee. So I always feel, I personally feel that this is a place which continues to hold out a lot of promise, a possibility of not just a multicultural Canada, but then that possibility of seeing a world in Canada. It could be a world of many differences, and the way in which those differences, there are ways in which differences try to relate to each other, and perhaps this is what we get to recognize, understand in Canada. And perhaps this is how Canada seems to be kind of different from other countries which have always welcomed migrants. Let me stop on this note, and perhaps we can all learn to discover from this our own roots, like the way in which this tree continues to discover different ways in which it can root itself to the ground. Thank you very much.